Alright, the long-awaited, that's rather presumptuous, probably, video of installing Windows 10 UEFI pre-2013 Macs, fixing the sound. So, off to a great start with the commentary. A couple tools we're using, flash drives. That one has Linux on it. There's a drive in there. It's the Windows install disk. Got 2 hard drives in this computer. One 1 terabyte, one 250 gigabytes. In many ways, like people wanting to install UEFI in these machines, in some ways are forced because you don't have an optical drive anymore. There is actually a way to just, if you have a spare PC, you install Windows in BIOS mode, and then you clone it over to a partition on here, and you can have a regular boot camp install that way. And obviously, for the disks to be different sizes makes it a lot easier on me, especially the way that I'm going to do it. So I have these 2 drives. It's going to be on the 250 gigabyte. And as we know, Apple always puts an EFI partition anytime you format a disk, which is actually not even part of the GPT white paper. It's just something Apple does. And for the most part, other OSs don't really care. Windows can be finicky. It really only wants one. You can use a bcd systore command and force it to choose a particular EFI partition. Sometimes with the presence of 2 EFI partitions, it doesn't like it. So we're not going to use disk utility to do anything at the moment. It's just sort of showing you. One thing we are going to do though, and because when I do Windows installs, I prefer having recovery drive, and just do it standard. So this is basically, let's see, it's off Microsoft's site, because I actually like using diskpart to set up partitions, make a recovery partition, and particularly like the GPD attributes and the ID for the recovery tools partition. I always have to have a printout of paper. I've yet to remember that string of characters. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this little text file that we GPT text. I'm going to take this text file. I'm actually going to move it over to Windows install. It's not going to hurt anything, and I can access it and actually copy and paste. So, I've got a terabyte, and that terabyte is just going to stay as it is. Yep, that's me. It's an old quality phone too. Doing its thing. Sorry for shaky handheld. That's how we roll right now. Get to this screen. People more familiar with Windows always know you Shift F10. Now we're here. We're also going to open up Notepad exe and browse to that file I made, I can copy some of this stuff. So now it's ESD. Open that GPT text file. Cool. I'm going to go to the scary command lines, but it's actually not that scary. Diskpart. It's like more powerful than the. You see what you can say? You can say list disk. I don't know what the fucking correct one is. That's for sure. Let's see. What I'm saying, it's so much easier to know. If I had 2 terabyte hard drives, I wouldn't necessarily be able to know which one was which, and I could easily delete the Mac one. But since they're different sizes, I know it's the 250 one. So I want to select, and in this case it's disk 1. And clean. The reason why I'm cleaning that disk is because I want it to be totally empty. Convert GPT. It should always already be that way, but just to make sure. I do it like this. Size equals 16. I'm going to create partition. Size is done in megabytes. This makes this like 120 something gigabytes. So there we go, like 123,000 megabytes. Oops. I forgot to create partition primary. Quick, file system equals NTFS. Label equals Windows 10. And we're going to assign it. W. Oops, that's misspelling. As you can see. I'm going to go to recovery. And we're basically, it needs to be like 700 megabytes, so it's like, same thing. Create partition primary. Size equals, let's say 650 is minimum. We'll make it 700. We'll be generous. Actually, we can just copy and paste from here because it's like it's the same thing. It's a format quick. Got to be labeled recovery tools. We want to assign it a letter R. And this is why I really have the text files, because this ID is a long string of characters. I don't know. I'm sure some system admins just remember that by heart. And it's GPT attributes. Oops. And we're going to list volumes. It's actually right now preemptively, no, we can do that later, and we can do that later in Linux. What I'm going to do later is also just create a fat 32 gigabyte partition, because I think it's awesome to have shared storage. Obviously you could do exFAT, You know, FAT32 has the limitations of file size. And on that Pro, world of accepting license terms we don't read. Basically, see, you made an MSR, you got your primary, it already defaults to know that that's what you're going to want to use. Bitchin'. So we'll spare you the install screens. And so it's having no problems at this point. You have a pure GPT disk. I think one of the issues people run into all the time is that the bootcamp tools are generally assuming you're making a hybrid partition table. Windows, unfortunately, is not smart enough to realize it's a hybrid partition table and basically just privileges the MBR part of that disk. So that's an issue. And that basically is why, you know, some of the other people on the forum, you can install gdisk for OS X terminal command. And that's built into Linux. That's one reason why having a Linux live drive is awesome, because you can remove a hybrid partition scheme, and sometimes you have to do that. It's one reason why I use diskpart. Obviously, if I was using that whole disk, Windows would automatically create a recovery tools, but I don't want to use the whole disk. I want to install Linux on another part of that disk, and I also wanted to remove that EFI partition. So your options are either load up Linux and just reformat the drive as GPT without that EFI. I only want one EFI partition on the machine. Everyone's bootloaders can be stored there. I also need to use Linux because I need to create little 100 megabyte HFS partitions to actually be the booters. Obviously I could use Refind or something like that, but sort of a funny, clever, kind of custom trick to use parts of what makes Apple's firmware unique, which is the ability to execute EFI executables. It's the Department of Redundancy department, to execute those EFI programs and be able to read it off an HFS disk. Generally, PC BIOSes can only execute things in FAT32 partition, that EFI partition. Well, Mac doesn't actually boot from the EFI partition. They have stage firmware updates there and stuff, but the actual boot file is located system library core services boot.efi, and you'll see where that comes into play later. But this is just prepping the stuff. Diskpart might seem daunting or super old school for some people, but it's really powerful, and it's always, that used to be the trick with installing Windows 7 on PCs, where you didn't want it to make a system reserve partition, and you wanted it to boot from, if you did the partitioning yourself in diskpart, it just always was more happy. It's one of those dumb laws of computers that the old school terminals and command prompts are actually where you can do much more heavy lifting. Just perhaps it's, you know, security through obscurity kind of thing that most normal users aren't going to want to do it that way. So there's sort of safety in that. But once you get the verbiage right, create partition primary, then a size, because what you're doing is you're not formatting that partition yet. It's always separate commands. I think you could actually probably string it together as one long command, but it's general practice. Create partition primary, then the size in megabytes, then format, I always choose quick because I'm not trying to wait around and have it write zeros to the disk and then format it. And then file system equals, NTFS, and then there's label equals, and what you want to call it. And there's assign letter. The reason why we assigned it W is because actually at this point during an install, the C drive is actually the little USB key. It's not going to be installing updates because it can't. Now, if I was connected to an Ethernet cable, it probably would be able to install updates. Don't really care about that at the moment. It's a fairly new. It was made on a USB drive creator on a Windows machine that usually scrapes newest versions with some of those updates and hot fixes already ready to go. Sorry, I'm shaky this morning. I guess I didn't drink enough coffee. I'm gonna restart now. And one of the caveats, obviously, with booting UEFI mode is that Windows wants to be the first partition, or the first boot in EFI sense. You can see how you can mess with that, and Windows won't boot just because it really wants to be the #1 order. It's funny, it's seeing the other key as like another Windows installation. So some people want to, that's one reason to install something like Refined, and make that the first thing that boots, because then you can choose Mac or Windows. I'm weird and I'm fine letting Windows default to be first, even though I'm often booting into Mac. I just hold Alt because I also like customizing that boot screen. This is pretty compelling stuff, I know, especially with the reflection of myself. Spare you guys this. So I decided to hold Alt during one of the boot ups, and this is what you're going to end up with, which I'll remove because I find EFI boot to be generic, and the only reason why it says EFI boot is because the Apple firmware senses that in the EFI folder there's a folder that's called boot. But for right now, this is how we're going to be booting Windows until I change it and make a custom booter partition. Literally, if I go in that EFI partition and in the boot folder under EFI, if I just wrote something in front of it, it would remove that. So it doesn't see like a folder that's just called boot. You're not going to see that EFI boot. I just find that like generic and not helpful. Also in the same way I've always complained about BIOS installs where you installed Linux, but Windows or Mac will always just make that drive say Windows. I like having a little more specificity. Maybe this was a dumb thing to start filming. I'm always like intrigued by adding a second layout, It's like, I don't have internet, which is actually better because I think doing an offline setup of Windows is actually better because they're like, want you to do all this stuff and sign you up for services. It doesn't make sense. They're like, don't you just want to sign in with a Microsoft One account and live in our... God, these are... This is my wife's computer, so I better make the security questions her answers. Everyone can see my security questions. Oh my god. And we'll write something funny, which is like not even true. I might delete it all after we install it, because it's not like she really wants Windows. And then they're going to be like, no, I don't want a fucking digital assistant. No thanks. Nope. Nope. They've really gotten more into this. They make people sign up for things that, like, things are defaulted to yes. Things that should be a no. Don't you want to just live in our ecosystem? I mean, I think that that's something that people actually love about Mac. And in many ways, things work great. Like having an iPhone and a PC is more difficult. I don't even think they make iTunes for at least Windows 7 anymore. So I guess I'll spare you the several minutes. Just trying to show you guys as much, because there's no smoke and mirrors. We're just installing Windows. It's not that big a deal. So here we are booted. No sound, as expected. Lower resolution, just because it doesn't have a video driver yet. So we're going to restart and go back into Mac. Because there are newer drivers available. But honestly, it's 100% fine using Boot Camp Assistant to download the drivers for your computer. So that same flash drive, we'll use that. Here we are. I have to format it though. Because what Boot Camp Assistant wants. So let's just erase it. I'm actually going to do an MBR. FAT32 drivers. Like it does that sometimes. It's like, we can't do it. It's like, no, you can do it. I've noticed that on Sierra. I feel like the disk utility has gotten worse. Really what it wanted to do was, had trouble unmounting it before reformatting it. I never used to have an issue like that. I guess it's just the letter D. Assistant, it's always going to give you some error, like, you don't have an optical drive, you can't do it. Let's download the latest support for Windows. It's going to see that key. And we're going to continue on battery power. Uh-oh. So I'll be back when that's done. Alright, so we have our flash key made from Boot Camp Assistant with the drivers. it's interesting that it's like, do you want to boot into your recovery volume? You can change that and just have it boot into Windows. But in some ways it's a good sign. It knows. I mean, you knew that from the install screen. It said recovery tools and it said type and it said recovery. So I'm actually gonna, it's very hard to hold the camera and know what I'm doing. Very lo-fi. I'm actually gonna, you can run it from this flash drive. And I'm actually gonna drag it into documents. Because it's just gonna run faster. The flash drive's pretty slow. I'm saying 4 minutes, which is kind of intense. I don't believe it. I just, run the drivers from a fast disk. For whatever reason, copying it, to a local disk. It's just going to run faster. Waiting the time for it to copy to that local disk, it's fine. I mean, this flash drive has been beat to hell, basically. So is there any summary of events? One, I like using Windows built-in partitioning tools. Guarantee you have a clean GPT disk, no hybrid partition. You can really specify the size of things. You can give yourself a recovery partition. And that's helpful in case something goes awry, And I think it's important. I mean, it sounds pretentious to say it's important, but I think knowing how to use those lower level and at the same time higher level tools is good education and good practice. I don't know, in some ways it makes more sense to me when you're using Boot Camp. Basically what it is assuming you're doing is that it's going to resize a partition. And actually I had a MacBook Pro 1.1, and that was the first time that Boot Camp Beta was released. You could actually get the beta version on Tiger. And I remember the first time I was installing Windows, I had missed the beta, and you couldn't install the beta anymore. But I had Leopard on another disk, and I was able to resize my Tiger partition, because actually it was either the 10.4.6 update or the 10.4.11 update, and what that allowed it to do to run Boot Camp was basically do online resizing of that partition, and then allowed you to create hybrid partition tables. It turns out that even though I didn't have the Boot Camp beta, I could have just gone into Terminal and used disk utility commands in Terminal that were not available in the GUI version of the app to do the resizing and that sort of stuff. So you can see it's crawled to a snail's pace, and then for whatever reason it's went from 4 minutes, 2 minutes, back up to 9 minutes now 30 seconds. Don't you love how accurate the time measurements, that all things I mean, Apple's all funny now, like when you're doing an OS install, it's like about 12 minutes. I mean, way to save themselves from being specific. I also don't understand how the time that something takes to copy can't sort of be calculated really exactly. I don't know. Or don't tell me anything. Don't even like tease me with the progress bar or some conjectured time it will take to finish. After that long-winded, long thing, let's rock it. Now, of course, you know the sound's not going to work. But if you install these drivers, those DLLs and other things are going to be there. I, for a long time, thought that the issue with sound had something to do with that it just wasn't the right drivers. Well, no, it's complicated, it turns out. And I think something that like is good about installing the boot camp drivers from Apple is that you're getting some of those Apple specific drivers. Obviously, for things like HD graphics, you can install third party or the newer version directly from vendors, but in terms of like the keyboard, the trackpad, backlight stuff, eyesight camera, you know, and yes, they're assuming that these are being installed in Windows 7 or something. They're older drivers. It doesn't really affect anything. You can later go on Device Manager and just roll the dice and be like, update driver. And there's also that program that I think Andrew had it on his video and I've used before where it scrapes the newest drivers for things. This doesn't really bother me. It seems to take even longer on the flash drive. Just for whatever reason, it's a fairly slow moving install. My status is just status. I'll come back when it's a little further. Alright. Let's see. Yeah, we'll restart. Don't worry. Okay, so you know, doing this assessment, we got our wireless. In this case, it was the Broadcom 331. So now we can, audio not working. And go to device manager. Which it's always funny they didn't even come up with device manager until you start typing manager. It doesn't even want you to know. So you guys are always going to end up with can't start, blah blah blah. But pretty much everything else is there. One of the advantages of UEFI install, on a BIOS install, you can do the MBR hack to enable AHCI mode. Otherwise, it crippled you to IDE speed on SSD, which is pretty shitty. So we are going to restart and we're going to fix that audio. I think I've gotten a lot more props on like DSDT editing for this thing, and honestly, it's literally just a copy and paste situation. Perhaps being somewhat familiar with the, being familiar with the software helps. Mackie ASL. This is our DSDT of this computer. Anytime you open it, it automatically is extracting it. When I'm doing other people's, I have to explicitly tell it to do that. So we go to that initial eGPU forum site. eGPU DSDT override, take you there. And honestly, this is, I'd given up on fixing it because I was sort of like, oh, what's the, use a dongle, blah, 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 blah. And so we're just literally adding this section to our DSDT. Copy, paste. Search for D word, which there'll be many, but you can tell the section, this is the section, all these D word entries. Let's go to the last one, return, insert it, doesn't have to be tabbed over. Sometimes I do that just for OCD, obsessive compulsive. Gonna compile it, no errors, warnings don't matter. And we're gonna save as DSDT dash modified dot AML. Might be one in there already. Guess not. Alright. Since I haven't made my FAT32 drive yet, but I still have my boot camp disk, I'm going to copy that DSDT modified into that little flash drive. Essentially, Windows does not, booted in UEFI, it doesn't allocate devices into 64-bit memory addresses. I explained that in my first post, but I think, which is essentially just a copy of that eGPU form. What the breakthrough was is that Macs have this DSDT that's just showing 32-bit memory addresses, when in reality it obviously has much more memory space to allocate devices. But Windows takes that root bridge definition as like the gospel, whereas Mac and Linux, they don't really care what that DSDT says. Oops. Did not make it right. There we go. Okay. So let's go back to that form. Unfortunately, we have to use the dreaded edge. Getting connected to a network. Blah, 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 blah. I'm just curious. It's connecting on there. Let's see if it's smart enough to take us there, more or less. And we already have a bunch of that stuff. So actually what I'm going to do first, and it's probably just confusing for people, when I've helped people out over email, I sort of remake the instructions more linear, because I'm gonna make this, you know, in their instructions they're making that directory much later. But I'm gonna make it now. Why not? Just make the directory. And before anything, I'm just going to take the DSDT I modified and put it in this new DSDT directory, which is already there. Alright, we need to install a couple things. The first one is window binary tools. So it's just a zip basically. Still scanning in case there's evil stuff. Alright. This. Now we're going to extract it. Where are we going to extract it to? We're going to extract it to that new DSDT folder, as stated in the instructions on the site. And actually, while that's happening, see, there we go. Let's extract this. And do the Windows driver kit. This one takes too long, in a way. And I actually don't even know if it's necessary. But maybe like a baseball player being superstitious, do it anyway. It's very... Yeah. No participation award for me. And this takes a little bit, so again, I'll spare you. And sorry for the sort of noisy, shaky, you know, there's a white noise machine living with the baby. Mom and the baby are asleep at the moment. So any way to obscure some of the noise, though, my voice has a tendency to carry. I'll be back when this is closer to being done. Alright. So it finished. And then there's this. Should we just go and copy? We've already made the directory, so I don't need that top part. And you know, one thing in that forum is that they are showing people how to compile it and use the Windows tools, and that's a lot actually what you're downloading. But I do it in Mac because it's much easier and visual. Copy and paste, press return. Alright. Now we're going to go to turn on. See, this section is basically about like using their compiling and decompiling DSTT tools. And no, we used Mac ASL. And I'm going to load the table. You know, all it says only works when test signing is on. Basically, it's completed successfully. Let's restart. So we modified our DSDT, and we're forcing Windows to use that instead of the 1 in the firmware. We've added a keyword entry. A keyword is a 64-bit entry. And also in the interim, I went to msconfig and got rid of that second Windows 10 entry. Because if you want to boot into recovery tools, you can just, A, it'll do that anyway if it is not working. B, you can just explicitly tell it to do that on the next boot. Just cleaner, not to have that second boot menu. And a sound. So that's, and it's funny, even though, you know, I guess the big wart on this process for people is that Thunderbolt still doesn't work, which I actually think I'll figure out. But I've honestly moved on to different things too. Now this is funny too, where it's like, this other high definition device is the display audio. It's interesting that it can see that, even though it ends up not working. But you literally, like, all right, that's the driver in that boot camp folder. Yep. So even though it doesn't work, you can find comfort in its aesthetic cleanness, that it's going to find a driver and you're not going to have that stuff. And you have audio on the Mac. Isn't that fun? Oh, and I hate that test signing thing. A lot of people are like, I don't like the way that looks. Well, it's also funny for no one to figure this out for 7 years, and finally people get their audio and still want to complain about that. Well, don't worry, folks. You download a universal watermark disabler. Untested build, oh no. It's an untested build. So now you have sound and no watermark, which is cool. Let's load in the stuff in the tray. I'm going to do that quick. One thing I always want to do is I want to make tap to click and 2 fingers be secondary tap, so I can get that like right click. You know what I mean? Alright, so now for like the more adventurous folks. We are going to make it not say EFI boot. So we're getting rid of that flash drive. This is a Linux Mint. It's probably like the oldest fucking flash drive ever. You can tell it's 4 gigabytes and that big. So you can do the math. I'm going to do 2 things. We might also just install Linux after this for the hell of it, because I think it's good. Let's get into Linux. Now, one fault of Linux is that it too, it's funny, it's like so blown out. It just looks like a white dot, but it's actually the Linux Mint logo. So the inadequacies of the camera, blah, blah, blah. One of the inadequacies of Linux is that since you're on a Mac, they assume that you also want a hybrid partition, which we don't. So perhaps annoying and laborious to some people, you have to, after you make your partitions in gparted, you have to go and make sure you remove. So I'm going to do it 32 gigs, FAT32. I will literally call it FAT32. I'm also going to make a 100 megabyte HFS plus. And we're going to call that, this is going to be what we're actually booting Windows from. So let's call it something cool. Because it's not cool, but it's specific. UEFI Windows. Right, like I said, here's the problem. It's going to make a hybrid on that stuff we just did because, you know, it just does that. It doesn't do that on like a official UEFI PC, but it knows you're on this Mac and trying to be helpful. And actually, a quick insight into this booter partition thing. If you ever install Fedora on a Mac, it's going to have you want to install Grub into an HFS partition because it can actually load those files. So that's, I believe this is SDB, we'll know right away. Let me just stop looking, trying to look at the screen through the camera. Oops. It says hybrid. Now I know that it's X for expert command, new for new partition, right. Oops. Now if we ran that again, no hybrid, it says protective. Because after I made those partitions, it was mad, blah, blah, blah. And actually, let's show what I was talking about with the EFI boot thing. Let's mount this. And so this is the EFI partition. see. We got actually all of our old ones in there because I've done this before on my wife's machine. Alright. Stop dicking around. Sorry, I'm like doing the worst video ever at the moment. It's just hard to do this one-handed, frankly. I'll delete those. For whatever reason, it keeps closing that window. See, these are all left over from previous. Previous installs of Linux and so these are the newly created ones. And what I'm going to do, get rid of that EFI boot, is I'll just also remind myself, because basically anything you install EFI is going to make a new boot folder, blah blah blah. Now I have Apple, Microsoft, and what used to be boot is now Windows boot. Again, sorry for the guerrilla style making of said thing. And what you notice is that EFI boot is gone. So at this point, we couldn't go into Windows. I could go back into Linux and remove that and have it say boot again. We would be good. But we're gonna do something else. One thing that gparted can't do is create journaled HFS drives. Now for these booter partitions, that doesn't really matter. But on my like Hackintoshes, I actually still like having just one EFI folder, even though that means that fucking Windows will never, or a Mac will not repair a disk because it erroneously thinks it needs an EFI partition, but whatever. So this UEFI thing, you can just enable journaling. So you can make the basic HFS partitions in Linux and then just enable them journaling in disk utility in Mac, and then you have sort of an official, more official thing. Alright, so we were in Linux, we mounted that EFI folder. I barely made it more confusing because there was still residual stuff from before when I had Android on here and Linux and FreeBSD and all that. So what you see now, this is this little booter partition. And something I did off camera, the gparted always makes it a regular Mac OS extended disk, not journaled. Well, after you make any HFS partition in Linux, you can just highlight it in disk utility and enable journaling. As you see, it's journaled. So we're going to need a couple files in here. Basically what we're doing is tricking Mac to think that it's booting a Mac. One really funny thing that really I think is funny is make a new file. Call it mock kernel. This is fake. That's funny. We're going to save it as mock kernel. And at this point, it's a rich text document. We're actually going to .info. we want to remove that extension. It's now just called mod kernel. Let's start building up the files in here that to trick Mac. One being this mod kernel file. Now we need to create the hierarchy system library. Core services. Spell that right? Now what we're going to have in here is two things. We need to mount that EFI partition. Now, I always keep a copy of Yosemite on my computer. Well, this doesn't have it. We can get the Clover configurator program. It doesn't require Clover, but one thing it will allow you to do, it lets me mount EFI partitions. And I'm literally going to copy this whole folder. And put this at also the root here. I'm also going to copy the boot mgr.efi. This goes system, library, core services. Copy that. We're going to make it think it's a Mac. And how do you do that? Well, we just call it boot EFI. That's the path to the Mac bootloader. Okay, that's part of it. The other thing, if we want to be extra cute, and in the end it actually doesn't really matter because I'm going to make that booter drive not auto mount to just show people how it works. So I copied that system version preference list. That's another thing in core services. This is what contains the system information. I forget the build of the windows. I'm just going to change this. We're going to make it say Microsoft, which is hilarious. Product name. Windows, product version 10, and we'll make it UEFI. And we'll save this. Oh wait, it still has that lock. That's funny. Doesn't matter. Did it anyway. I'm going to copy this system version. So now we have this little booter file, booter drive. Now see if Sierra is hip to it. Just sort of proof of, like, see, because that's there, it now shows up. If I clicked this, it's going to think it's BIOS installed. The reason where it's scraping UEFI Windows, that's the name of the disk, and that it's Windows UEFI, is because of that system version stuff. But right now it wouldn't boot correctly. So what we need to do is we need to bless this. So we're going to open a terminal. Get into our sudo commands. Sudo bless folder equals, well, what's the folder that file is in? There. And then what's the actual file? UEFI boot option. And now what we should see come up is that booter partition. Mac thinks it's a Mac disk because it has mock kernel, it has system library, blah 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 blah. I don't know why it's being a funny one. Oh, didn't let me finish. Didn't let me finish. I think that flash key in there was getting in its way, so to speak. So let's do this again. No, I don't want to shut down. I want to restart. Sorry, it's sort of probably all over the place, and I've made this video so many times. Well, look, what do we have here now? UEFI Windows. Now there's a chance it won't boot because it's not first in order. See, it still has Mac being first in the boot order. So those boot partitions only work if it's first in order. Well, there's a couple things we can do to fix that. For shits and grins, you can see if picking it as the startup disk will make it be set boot. And that bless command, I could have added the tail of it doesn't like that either. Okay, so what to do? Well, what to do in this case? Restart. Two things you could do. You need to go to the UEFI firmware and change the boot order. And make sure that Windows is #1. And one place we can do that is a Linux live CD. And probably what I normally do is I usually have Linux installed anyway, and so I change the boot order from a resident install, but that doesn't really matter. So what I've explained is that to use these boot partitions, only Windows has to be the first one. When I do FreeBSD and I do Linux and do other things like that, they don't care. They're fine not being first. So there's always like sort of funny so open up a terminal, sudo UEFI boot mgr. As you can see, it's saying that Mac OS is first. Well, you do that same command, -O, that's for the order. Now we're going to change it. We're going to make it go 000. Then 0080. Now Windows Boot Manager is first. Pull that flash disk out. We got our UEFI Windows. Boots to Windows 10. Windows. Windows with sound. Booted from a custom boot partition. Now obviously the caveat of that is I just restart this computer, it's always going to default to booting into Windows first. You could install something like Refine and make that the first in the order. But I'm fine with that because I think it's pretty cool to use Mac's built-in bootloader against it. As you can see, I have really cool icons for my OS X, and not the Windows. Well, that's like sort of a funny Apple trick or something, that there's a hidden file that's called, it begins with a period, volume icons. So let's make a different icon for that booter. I think it's icon archive. Didn't let me finish typing. So I'm an idiot. There we go. Let's just get a generic one. Any of these will do. You want an ICNS file. So let's just make it this one. Let's download this ICNS file. Here it is. What you do is you put it at the root of a drive. In this case, UEFI Windows. Now we're going to use Terminal because only in Terminal can you really, I mean, there are third-party programs that help you do this kind of stuff. And what's funny, in Unix terms, it's not really renaming. I'm doing a sudo move command. So sudo move, and it's going to the same place, but I'm essentially moving it by retitling it. And it's going to be titled period volume icon.icns. What's this sudo password? As you can see, it's now invisible there. It doesn't see it. Let's restart again and see if that icon's stuck. These booter partitions work with any EFI. And like I said, Fedora, Linux automatically sets it up like this. Cool. Now when you press Alt, you don't look at that stupid generic hard drive logo. You have a Windows icon. It's titled what you want it to be titled. And yes, there's a lot of customization you can do in Refine and stuff like that. I just think it's funny that Mac at this era, Apple rather, made their UEFI spec its own thing, sort of non-compliant. And the one thing special about it is the ability to boot EFI executables from HFS drives. So why not use that for you or against them in a certain way? Because I'm sure that that wasn't really the intention that they had in mind, that you would be installing exotic operating systems. And here's the sort of final piece. It can be confusing for a user to have that 100 megabyte booter partition visible on the desktop. Well, is there a way to make volumes not auto mount? It turns out there is. Now again, I guarantee there's going to be some, I don't want Clover configurator, there's going to be some leftover, that F's talking too much about different things. There is a way to make things not auto mount. One thing that you need is you need that UUID. It's universal unique identifier for this particular disk. And so what you do is you make an fstab file, which Mac totally knows what to do with, though it's not built by default. And I'm saying there's probably leftover because I probably have the old fstab file in here. Its path, the same that it is on FreeBSD, etc fstab. Fstab's in a file system table. It's like, what are the drives, what are their mount points, do they auto mount, yada yada yada. See? I still have all these old booters. So basically, I'm actually gonna start fresh. But I'm gonna keep the top line and just replace the UUID. And the reason why I'm starting fresh is because I probably will install Linux on here and just keep your fstab file clean. And basically, all this fstab file contains is the UUID of the drive, options, what file system it is, in this case HFS, and saying no auto. What that means is that it's not auto mounting. So I'm going to take Control C. And I'm going to delete this one. Control X to exit, save it. Yep. We don't need that. Oops, see, didn't get it in time. Restart just to show you how you can use an fstab table if you didn't want drives to auto mount. You could obviously always mount them from disk utility. They'll just appear grayed out at the beginning. So let's just restart this bitch. So cool. I mean, maybe it's only cool to me, but you can have a very custom boot picker. On my personal laptop, I have 3 versions of OS X, 2 Linux kernels, FreeBSD, Windows 10. Used to have Windows 7, a hack that could do GOP boot, but was just unstable. And as you can see, that UEFI disk is not auto-mounted anymore. So just for like users, it makes it cleaner and clearer. It still obviously exists, but it's grayed out because I've made an fstab file. And that's about it. I mean, I guess I'm gonna do it again for Linux, but that's all, folks. Alright, so why not do Linux? Sort of perhaps reinforces. I mean, I'm going over a lot of material in a bad video with a white noise machine, so it sounds like I'm on an airplane. But for those who have some knowledge of some of these things, or this is a type of video that can help cue some of that understanding
you know, doing another install sort of makes sense in terms of, okay, I'm renaming the boot folder in EFI something else so I don't get the EFI boot icon. After I install Linux, Linux is going to be number one, and then if I clicked that Windows icon, it would boot to Linux. I just need to reset that order because Linux is actually fine not being number one.
So we'll do the trusted G part. Obviously not touching that disk. So we're gonna,
let's first make the little booter. And I'm sort of being Mac style by having a little space in between those partitions. HFS.
I'm gonna be very specific. Linux Mint 19. Now let's make the partitions for Linux.
I'm just going to save a little bit for swap. I want ext4.
It's going to be like a little tiny swap partition,
which is going to be
Linux Mint. For that last partition, as people familiar with Linux, you don't actually need a swap partition, but it just is happier and blah 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 blah. Because we made some partitions in gparted, we will make sure with gdisk, which is built into Linux, that we remove any remnants of it being a hybrid partition table. Expert, new, write. Yes. Let's install Linux.
I'm gonna have like some dumb injury. In weird ways, I have to hold this camera on my body.
Oftentimes between these two screens there's a fair amount of delay because
it's scanning the disks and it's trying to be helpful and be like, I can install it alongside. But similar to my style of installing Windows, I do it manually. It also just like enabled the Wi-Fi. And so it's like, alongside them? No, we're doing something else.
Change this partition we just made. It's going to be in which it is. And sometimes you get this message, we need to resize it, but that's actually kind of a bug in the install because I say no, but it still sticks that that's the root. It's going to say that partition's been marked for swap. And they would give me a warning that I didn't say to format it, which I didn't because I just did format it. Chicago. And I'm just doing the same stuff. Installing. A lot more information and tell you what it's actually doing. Well, that's not always super helpful. Linux install is pretty quick. It's a pretty lean operating system, as it were. That, unfortunately, is the sound of the Joule vaporizer, which I quit for a year and then decided to pick up bad habits, especially respiratory habits, during a respiratory pandemic. Clearly smart, huh? Almost finished. That's the one problem with enabling the third-party stuff. And that's not a problem, because I actually didn't sign into Wi-Fi. Because I don't want it to, like, scrape for updates at this point. I really just want it to moveon.com. Again, sorry for video quality, shakiness. Blurriness. Rambling narration. But you know, I tried doing this so long ago with my dad's friend who runs professional cameras, and I had this whole setup, and it was a little too high production, and I never could fucking finish it. So I decided today, baby's taking an early nap, sneak my wife's computer away, and just do this video handheld. That's it. And when we reboot, we're going to be greeted with the dreaded EFI boot icon, because Linux has now installed the boot folder in EFI. And in addition to that, it's made this no longer top dog. So let's fix that. first thing. That little booter we made. I didn't show this process last time. Linux Mint 19. Let's enable journaling. Now it's official. Let's also mount our Windows booter, because we're basically going to copy some of those things. We're also going to mount our EFI again. I guess really the main thing that we're going to copy, because we're going to copy the EFI folder, the new one that contains the Linux stuff. That's all we really need from there. Clover configurator. I'm going to hit two birds with one stone with this. I'm going to mount the partition. I'm going to open it. We now have a new boot. You can guess who that is. I'm just going to title it Linux boot. Okay, so now we've gotten rid of EFI boot from the beginning. Copy this. And we're not going to use the boot EFI. I mean, we copied it over. We're going to copy grubx64. Get rid of this. Copy grub. We're going to rename it as we did before. Boot EFI. And actually another little trick is that we are actually going to need the grub configuration file in core services too, because that's its config for knowing what other entries are there. And we're going to change this, even though the dates are wrong. Don't care. Product name, Linux Mint. We're going to kind of do this backwards, because I did it backwards the first time. I'm going to say UEFI. I'm going to say 19.3. Alright, now we need to do the good old bless. Sudo bless folder equals that's the folder it's in. File equals happy. We won't see EFI boot. We should see our newly created Linux Mint 19 folder. It really hates this flash drive sometimes. Which seems to also just lose its mind. Put that in it. Okay. Now I have Linux Mint 19. Oh, we're in grub. Okay. And one thing we're going to check, obviously, is that since Linux was installed after Windows, Linux is now the main bootloader. So we're going to do sudo EFI boot mgr. Yep, you see, Don't look at the list. Look at the boot order, and you can see that they've made Ubuntu 1. So we're going to change that, because Windows has to be number 1. So I'm going to make it Windows, Linux, then Mac. Now it says it's correct. Just makes everybody still happy, and everybody's still working. And this works for FreeBSD. It works for other Linux distributions. It works for Haiku, which is the BOS, basically new BOS. Anything that has an EFI executable. And let's make sure Windows. You can do this. Actually, I don't know if the new version of I never got Oracle Solaris to finish its boot. I have that on other machines though. Oops. Well, it doesn't matter. I know my password, obviously, but let's just, I guess people are very cynical. So here's Windows with sound working, blah, blah, blah. Windows boots, Linux boots. I'm not even going to go into it. I'm just going to command reboot because I want to do the same thing we did. Make a cute icon and also have it not auto mount that booter partition. Same thing. Well, actually, let's not. Well, it doesn't matter actually because it won't unmount till the next boot. I want to get its UUID. Thank you very much. Get back in that fstab file. Oops. Copy this. Paste it. We're going to replace that UUID with the one for this Linux booter drive. Oops. No. Don't want to do it like that. It's good to show your fuck ups or keystroke errors and stuff like that, you know? There we go. Let's not have a space in between. So that won't auto mount. We'll get back into terminal in a second because we also want to get a nice little icon for Linux. Sorry, I don't know where I was holding the camera. Icon archive. Same thing, didn't let me finish. I'll give you our cute little penguin. Download that ICNS file. Copy this to Linux Mint. And then sudo move. The reason why I drag it there right away is because it's just gonna make the path correct, and all you need to do is just change dot volume icon dot ICNS. And there it disappears. And you get to use Apple's built-in loader. Cool. UEFI Windows. Let's go Linux Mint 19. So as I said before, that's sort of just part of the thing, is that you're just trying to, like, gain ownership of your stuff. And I think that for many people it's fine to not, a computer for most people should be very appliance-like. It's what I do professionally, so I'm interested in really understanding how things work. And that's fine. But see, because I picked it at the beginning of the install, I don't, a lot of times you have to like be on the internet, blah, 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 for that Broadcom driver to get initialized. Well, when you choose install third-party Wi-Fi, and you have the initial flash install key in, it doesn't need to go on the internet to get that proprietary driver. You actually installed it. So, as you can see, Wi-Fi networks are available. That's pretty much, I could do other weird ones in the future. Perhaps this video is just further confounding to people. But it's an exploration into how UEFI partitions work, the booting process, how the Mac file structure. And so you've got this sort of amazing boot screen. You can customize with any icons you want, as long as they're ICNS. They got to kind of be the right size. I used to have hers all different pictures of fruit. This is just to show, like, if you really want it to be the icon, it can be that way. And there we are. Back to our Windows with sound, using our own booter. We never deleted the boot files in UEFI. We just changed their title so they don't, mess stuff up. And that's the story. And if this was a machine I was actually going to use, I would net PLWiz and make sure you don't even need to sign in to get onto Windows, blah, blah, blah. But that's the gist of it.